You slip through Sasha's open window, floating over the sill lined with artifacts from her travels. A white seashell, a small gold pagoda, a pair of red dice. Her harp is in one corner with its small wood stool. She's asleep in her narrow bed, her burned red hair dark against the sheets. You kneel beside her, breathing the familiar smell of Sasha's sleep, whispering into her ear some mix of, "I'm sorry," and "I believe in you."
So all this snow and the worst cold stayed to the west of the Appalachian range. So I believe the coldest it got here was about maybe -1 or something like that. So mild for this particular bomb cyclone or Arctic cyclone or whatever it's called.
Yeah, what is it? Atmospheric river, that's one of them.
Atmospheric river, bomb cyclone, Arctic blast.
No. Arctic vortex, I believe.
Polar vortex. Polar vortex, Arctic blast.
You know what these are?
Band names?
No, these are Gatorade flavored.
They're totally Gatorade flavored.
And now try new Arctic blast.
Atmospheric river.
It's August and you're playing football in the Crimson Tide Stadium in Alabama. The only thing that can cool your thirst? Arctic blast.
And like in the background, there's like a bunch of like babes playing chainsaws as if they're guitars.
Yeah, babes playing chainsaws.
Wearing like booty shorts made out of like logging pants.
and then Patagonia foul weather gear on top.
This is brilliant. This reminds me of a recurring upper middle brow segment that I was going to pitch to you as a new idea. We can discuss it more properly at another time. But it's movies that should have been made, which was kind of inspired by Reservoir Royale, which is a texting chain you and I had yesterday. Where
Such a good texting chain.
I was listening to the Zodiac episode, and there's a moment where you refer to Daniel Craig being tortured by Michael Madsen. Which, like, listener, the actor who plays Le Chiffre is Mads Mikkelsen. I do this all the time. It's a similar name,
yeah.
But I'm just imagining the torture scene from Reservoir Dogs. Because you remember, they wanted James Bond to be more kind of dark and like serious. It was a reboot, right? So it's just like, and you just imagine like, what if Mads Mikkelsen had like sliced Daniel Craig's ear off in that scene instead of merely abusing his genitals with a towel.
Which is a pretty rough scene. It was
already pretty rough, yeah.
By a really strange interlude in all of Bond, which I refer to as the towel convalescence scene.
That is exactly what you were comparing. I don't know if you remember this, but you were carrying Sangamon Taylor's Time in the White Mountains to the towel convalescence. It was not a kind comparison.
No, right? I hate that section. Like Casino Royale is one of those like strange creations where for 2/3 of the movie it's doing exactly what you want it to, and then it's like the directors are like, you know what this movie needs? It needs to be a romance novel. And you're like, with like a weird, strange, emotionally over the top ending.
I still think of that as a new movie. It probably came out in 2007 or something. I'm like, that's like the new James Bond. Like, because I still think of kind of Pierce Brosnan as sort of the new James Bond, but I'm like, well, Daniel Craig's the new James
And Bond. I'm just gonna fade this digression out. We talked about this for like nearly another half hour. And it's funny, but you're here for a visit from the Goon Squad Part 2, so we'll get to that soon. We might post this digression as a bonus episode at some point, so look for that. We did propose a new movie written by Benjamin Payne and directed by Ryan Johnson called Glasses Out, a sideways mystery, which I think is a brilliant idea. Yeah, a story for another time. While I have you here, I want to tell you about a podcast you might enjoy. It's called Big Campaign Stories or Big Campaign Podcast, and it is a real play podcast. That means you're listening to people play a role-playing game. Honestly, I was not sure I would be into that. Chris is more the RPG guy, but I found this really fun to listen to. I remember when I played D&D as a teenager, I remember being really obsessed with leveling up and getting treasure and trying to win the quest. And these players are actually really committed to character development. So it feels like you're watching a good improv troupe. It's set in a kind of Snow Crash-like world. In fact, they say it's inspired by Snow Crash, and of course we're big fans of Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash. It's the first book we talked about on Upper Middlebrow. But in this particular scenario, there's also magic, there's some non-human species as well, and the Game Master Jeff is really great at world building and has a super fun presentation style. So I just enjoy listening to this kind of structured improv theater. I think it would be a great podcast if you were on a long road trip and wanted some company. These guys feel like friends pretty quickly. You can search for Big Campaign Stories in your podcast app, or you could go to www.bigcampaign.com/podcast. So now let's get back to a gizzet from the Goon Squad. Sorry, Jen.
Yeah, let's dive into a recap.
Okay, so I'll start us off with, I will say, I at one point had a physical copy of this book from the library, but I had to give it back. So I've only really listened to this book. And I tried to listen to some of the chapters twice. So I may be a little bit less prepared for this than others, but I think you'll make up for that. But
yeah, I'm definitely, I'm like, can we just keep talking about this book?
So chapter 7, which is called A to B, the narrator is Stephanie, who is Benny's wife, and this is set maybe just a couple years before the opening chapters, because they're still married and they're kind of freshly divorced by the kind of first two chapters. But in the early chapter, Chris, the son, is still a kid, and he's a kid in this, so it's within 3 to 5 years, I think, of our opening chapter.
Yeah, he's I think he's 11 or 12 in the opening chapter, and I think he's 7 here. So yeah, okay. I mean, he's still a kid.
Yeah, so that sounds about right. And Stephanie and Benny have joined a very waspy country club where Benny's slightly brown skin, being, I believe, Mexican-American, even though he strikes me as being kind of culturally rather assimilated into the broad American culture. He doesn't talk with an obvious accent or anything like that. But just the fact that he has slightly dark skin and a Latin-sounding name apparently leads to some weird looks and other microaggressions. Stephanie's the narrator of this chapter. Both she and Benny have mixed feelings about the country club, but Stephanie finds that she really likes playing tennis with a frenemy. I forget the frenemy's name, but a waspy woman. And Stephanie is a very good athlete, and she develops a kind of almost affair-like devotion to the tennis playing, where she stops telling Benny about it because Benny, understandably, has dark feelings about the country club. So she'll make up excuses to do work-related things that are sort of true, but maybe the work thing's happening at 2 and she'll leave at 11, so she has time to go play some tennis. As all this is happening, her brother has moved in with them, Jules, and we've learned that Jules was an aspiring writer and journalist who assaulted a movie star and did some time in prison and is out and is kind of, he's clearly insightful. He's kind of somebody you don't necessarily want along with you in a car trip because he'll sort of make observations about your mental state that you don't necessarily want somebody making. And at one point, they go into town together and take a meeting with Bosco, the guitar player from, I forget the name of the band, but the band that Benny kind of made his career and reputation producing. Bosco, in the way of somebody like Robert Smith, is now an aging overweight rock star. Again, there's something a little bit old fashioned about this sort of depiction of the music industry here too. This all feels very 80s and 90s, but Bosco is kind of drinking and eating himself to death, but wants to go on a final tour and wants Stephanie's firm to publicize it. And basically, it's going to be a suicide tour because he's going to perform in the wild way that he used to perform, and he expects that's going to kill him. And Jules, the writer, is there during all of this time and is like, this is a great idea. I want to write about it. And Bosco and Jules have kind of like an immediate like friend love. And Jules is like, great, you have exclusive access. You're going to document my suicide tour. And I think that's more or less how that chapter ends. Did I miss anything?
And the moment of racism that he experiences is a sort of thuggish, foolish, white conservative man at the country club when discussing 9/11 and possible Al-Qaeda operatives in New York, keeps kind of like motioning towards, like with his eyes and with his head, towards Benny.
Which is like triply stupid.
Yeah, it's like, it's so over the top dumb that you begin to believe it.
So basically the idea that Benny's slight brown complexion makes him look sort of Middle Eastern. And of course, Middle Easterners must be suspect of terrorism in the post 9/11 world. The other thing I forgot, the very last thing that happens in the chapter is Stephanie discovers that Benny is having an affair with her tennis partner, which we don't know, but is probably the precipitating event of their eventual divorce.
Chapter 8, one of my favorite chapters of the book, is called Selling the General. And we shift from Steph's point of view to the point of view of her boss, who in chapter 7 is named Ladal, but then we discover is simply named Dolores, or in this point, Dolly, who has fallen on hard times after she has thrown a disastrous party where she had set up these kind of like plastic troughs that were full of water and oil that were hanging up above the party. And she didn't really get anybody to help her out with design. The heat from the lights melt the plastic and shower hot oil down on her guests, completely ending her career as a star of the publicity realm.
And landing her in prison too, right? For a few years.
Yeah, that's right. She has sort of like a Martha Stewart-esque like stint in. She does 6 months in prison, and she emerges not quite penniless but close. The thing that calls her to action is her daughter Lulu, who attends a expensive upper crusty, I think middle school or primary or secondary school in Manhattan. And so Dolly now is trying desperately to pay that tuition bill, and she takes a job as the publicist of a genocidal dictator. I think in South America, from the depictions of it, I can tell
or Africa,
doing.
Or Asia.
Yeah, the sort of archetypal, like
sort of a Pinochet type.
Yeah, she has taken up the job of trying to publicize and make popular the general, who is a terrible, terrible person. She has a modest success where she gets the general to wear a hat that makes him look endearing after some initial terrible missteps. And then she has the idea.
They leave the flaps tied at the bottom of his neck, giving him a double chin. And she has to intervene and says, take some scissors and cut the ties.
Yeah, he's described as like looking like a genocidal baby. It's like,
absurd.
Her next idea is to to humanize the general by connecting him with a kind of affable American movie star. And the one that she hits upon is Kitty Jackson, who we have heard about from the previous chapter. Dolly is able to get Kitty to agree because Kitty is kind of also out of options. the two of them and Dolly's daughter, Lulu, all fly to the general's location. Kitty and the general are introduced. At first, it is going off marvelously. Kitty kind of transforms herself into the perfect film love interest ingenue that she's supposed to do. Dolly imagines that her life is going to get back on track. And then Kitty goes off script and begins asking the general what he does with all of the people that he has killed in his genocide. Kitty is taken away into the general's compound. And things seem like they're really going to turn out badly, but they don't. Kitty Jackson somehow manages to win the general over. Photographers show up at the general's compound. And
basically the paparazzi save the day, right? Like that the fact that the paparazzi are there compels the general to show Kitty in good health, and then they take photos of them, and then the general sort of enjoys the fact now that the photos are being taken of him with this movie star, and becomes very sanguine about the whole thing.
Yeah. And Dolly gets a wonderful lump sum payment, kind of like getting her the nut that she needs to leave to support herself, and she and Lulu leave New York.
So we'll move on. The next one is 40-minute lunch. Another, I think, tour de force chapter. You come to realize this is Jules' interview with Kitty about 10 years before the events of the prior chapter, and a couple years before the events of the prior chapter. This is the incident where Jules is interviewing Kitty and assaults her. It's written as Jules' article, and Jules as a journalist is sort of like a combination of David Foster Wallace, Hunter Thompson, and a psychopath. So it's this exquisitely described kind of blow-by-blow account of Jules and Kitty having lunch, and he does this sort of meta-journalism thing where for the audience he narrates his efforts to try to get her to open up so he can get a good story, and also shares details about his failing, crumbling life and his divorce and other things like that. I mean, clearly with the footnotes, I feel like it's pretty obvious to me that it's a kind of loving satire of David Foster Wallace's journalistic style from about this era, but without Wallace's general kindness towards the world. This guy is a kind of self-hating troll. He tries a number of conversational gambits to kind of try to anger her, throw her off her guard. And in order to gain a little bit of time, he invites her for a walk in Central Park, and then gets her to genuinely open up with a kind of random question about horses. And it turns out that Kitty actually really likes horses and starts talking about horses. And then in a moment where I don't know if he confuses her interest in horses with interest in him, or he's just overwhelmed by his desire for this very beautiful person, sexually assaults her. And she defends herself with a pocket knife, successfully ending the assault, and he is arrested and sent to prison, where he's composing this article, and then issues a footnote about how he thinks crimes like this could be prevented in the future, involving essentially surveillance of people who walk in parks. The voice of the chapter is lovely, and I'm not doing it justice. It's absolutely brilliantly voiced in the character of Jules.
No, I think you are doing it justice. I think in your description of its sort of its influences, spot on. Like that, it does have that very freewheeling, self-referential, very intelligent. And you're right. Like Jules does hate himself, and it feels like the reason that he assaults Kitty. Because there's this moment where he says that she's actually quite boring. And that you realize through the progress of this chapter that Kitty Jackson is simply a vessel for American idolatry, to sort of project its wishes and desires upon her. And that she is actually a real person, but that is kind of being ignored by the world, which is
Jules.
it gives some idea of... And Jules, and Jules, in the a monstrous act of projection, tries to literally project himself onto her. And it's also one of the more uncomfortable chapters to read.
Yeah, it's not fun. Do you want to give us the next chapter?
Yeah. Chapter 10 is called Out of Body. And this is the chapter that every time I read this book, maybe I don't cry, but holy shit, I get
very
close.
Sad.
It is so heartbreaking. It's the only chapter that is written in second person. We're in the narration of Sasha's fake college boyfriend, Rob. We're back to Sasha, who I'm not sure. Sasha is definitely close to one of the main characters of the book.
Yeah,
but in
Sasha
the way that
and
Egan
Benny sort of form
the
twin spines of the book.
Yeah. The two towers,
the two
as
towers.
they were. Sort of confusing
which one is
Manhattan geology with like Tolkien all of a sudden.
Well, sort of famously, nobody knows which two towers the Tolkien book, The Two Towers, is about, because there are like 8 towers in that book.
Yeah, you're like, is it Minas Tirith? Is it Is it Mordor? Is it Orthanc?
Yeah,
like,
right.
So many.
It should be called The 8 Towers, but
so we're in Rob's narration, and basically this is a chapter in which Rob, who is closeted, we get the strong impression that he is gay.
Sort of Ripley-esque too, kind of angrily closeted.
Yeah, totally. He's very attracted to Sasha's real boyfriend named Drew. And over the course of the chapter, we learn that Rob has recently tried to kill himself. And Sasha had visited him in his hospital room and kind of like crawled into his hospital bed and is like, you really can't do this again. They're very close.
Yeah.
And Rob and Sasha and Drew go out to a conduits show where Sasha meets Benny Salazar, her future boss. And Rob and Drew have taken some ecstasy. Yeah. Sasha, in that way of, I think all of us can remember those evenings when our friends and us were perhaps on different drug arcs.
Or emotional arcs.
Yeah. But Sasha kind of is like, all right, I'm gonna go to this party. I think there's an opportunity here with Benny Salazar professionally, and she heads off to do that. And Rob and Drew kind of have a Ulysses-esque evening at different clubs and bars. Another one of their friends, Bix, who is kind of a Mark Zuckerbergian future tech figure.
He describes email to them.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
In the future, we'll be able to send letters on our computers to one another.
And Bix, fun side note, is a main force in the follow-up novel, The Candy House, where he has come up with something called the Affinity Charm. Rob finally kind of confesses his affection for Drew. Drew, who we know is a sportsman and a swimmer, decides to jump into I think it's the East River.
Yeah, and I think they were somewhere in the vicinity of the Williamsburg Bridge, or no, the Manhattan Bridge.
Yep. That's right, because they describe looking south towards the Brooklyn Bridge, and it looks like a harp, the instrument that Sasha plays. Rob decides to get in the water as well, and is quickly kind of caught by a current and swept away. And we learn later that he drowns from this event, but not before maybe having a moment where he is almost saved. It's unclear at the end of the chapter, but Drew does try to save Rob, but is not able to.
We learn that later. The chapter ends ambiguously.
Yeah. And do you want to take us into chapter 11?
Yeah, chapter 11. So this chapter is set a little bit before the last chapter, a couple years before, when Sasha is in fact in the midst of her terrible time in Europe. She's in Naples. She's living, I don't know if exactly prostitute is the right word, but she has sex with her drug dealer in order to get drugs. And I don't know if she has sex with anybody else or just him, but she also is kind of like a pickpocket. And yeah, maybe we'll kind of like shack up with somebody in order to get food and shelter for a little bit. And meanwhile, her uncle Ted, or Teddy, is looking for her. This is her mother's brother, who has been hired by her stepfather, who's wealthy. And Ted is an art history professor, and he's sent there to look for her and kind of shirks his duties with only minimal guilt, and just goes looks at art, which, it's just sort of like, is there anybody in this novel who behaves morally and like honestly at any point? I just can't imagine, honestly, like being sent to look for my niece or nephew and doing anything but that. I'm not the best person ever, but it just feels like a rather blatant shirking of duty and responsibility. But he does really like art, and he has a particular moment at a particular museum with a depiction of Orpheus and Eurydice that seems important. And then sort of shortly after that, just blunders into Sasha, invites her to dinner. They go out and have dinner, and then they end up at a bar and a dance club. She picks his pocket. He finally is motivated by sort of guilt and shame about not actually doing what he's there to do, and makes an honest effort, tracks her down, and kind of decamps in front of her apartment and talks with her. And I don't really remember... I just kind of gather that leads to her eventually coming back to the United States. He is in that moment sort of a good uncle, because she keeps telling him to leave and he refuses to leave. And one sense is that in the way that kids will push adults away, but secretly want them to stay and show that they love her, that's kind of what's going on. And he kind of passes that test. And maybe you can remind me how the chapter ends. What's implied is that she comes back to the United States and starts going to NYU on her parents' dime as a kind of old college student.
Yeah. But, she ends up at NYU probably 3 or 4 years after this, a freshman at 21, which we learned in the previous chapter. And a lot of the emotional heft of this chapter comes from Ted's remembering of the summer that Sasha's parents split up when Sasha was 5. Her biological father sounds like a real jerk who dislocates her mother's shoulder twice and I think breaks her arm. And a lot of these times, Ted is kind of there to get Sasha out of the house and take her swimming. And there are just these like wonderful depictions of him really acting like a very loving uncle. And
Sasha as a very kind of beguiling, precocious child.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah. She does a wonderful impression of her mom. It says, "Oh, Uncle Teddy, you wear me out." But yeah, the chapter ends with a big expositional but beautiful section where on another day, more than 20 years after this one, after Sasha had gone to college and settled in New York, after she'd reconnected on Facebook with her college boyfriend and married late when Beth had nearly given up hope, and had 2 children, one of whom was slightly autistic, when she was like anyone, with a life that worried and electrified and overwhelmed her, Ted, long divorced, a grandfather, would visit Sasha at home in the California desert. He would step through a living room strewn with the flotsam of her young kids and watch the western sun blaze through a sliding glass door. And for an instant, he would remember Naples, sitting with Sasha in her tiny room, the jolt of surprise and delight he'd felt when the sun finally dropped into the center of her window and was captured inside her circle of wire.
Yeah, that's right. I remember that. I had sort of placed that in the next chapter, since the next chapter is sort of set in the present of that description. But, well, and then do you want to do the next chapter?
Sure. The next chapter, a famous chapter, because I think when this book came out, the thing that people would run up to me saying would, like, students and other teachers at the school where I was teaching would come up to me and be like, "There's a chapter in this book that's a PowerPoint presentation." And like, until I read it, I was like, how is that possible?
That's funny because that doesn't seem particularly more innovative or strange than a chapter in second person to me now. But maybe at the time that was unusual, or it seemed very innovative.
but it is from the point of view of Sasha's daughter, Allie. We're not sure if this is the one who might be slightly autistic or her other child, Lincoln.
I would guess it's Lincoln, based on the fixation with rock and roll pauses. But Allie also has her own fixations. Yes.
She sure does, yeah. And this is the section of the novel where this idea of the present starts to get a little confusing. But we're in the latest time frame we will achieve in this book, which I think is around 2020.
I think that's right, yeah. We could call this the future,
yeah,
or we could call it the second present, the new present.
The new present, I like that. And what this PowerPoint presentation is essentially about is about Allie, the daughter, examining her family, and mostly her brother Lincoln's obsession with pauses in rock and roll music. And he catalogs them and thinks about them, and mostly confuses his dad, Drew, who is like a sort of good Samaritan doctor.
Drew is a blandly good dude. He lacks the excitingness of the other characters, but also is just a pretty good guy.
Maybe he's the one person in this book that
he might be. I mean, he does make a few parenting mistakes, but then he immediately feels bad about them and apologizes.
Yeah, that parenting mistake is the climax of this chapter, where Drew, sort of frustrated with and not understanding Lincoln's obsession with pauses, he kind of blows up at Lincoln, and Sasha does the exposing of this for us here. That really what Lincoln is trying to do is to communicate with his dad and tell him that he loves him and that he carries around a fear of the end.
Sasha tells us a rock and roll pause is a very tiny near-death experience.
Yeah, and Drew, hearing Sasha explain this to him, realizes this, tries to reconcile with Lincoln, is mostly successful, and then takes Allie on a walk in the desert. And we see one of the first ways that this particular future is dealing with the changes in the Earth's climate, that huge swaths of the desert have been turned into solar panels. And they're out there when all of the solar panels sort of move as one to track the movement of the moon. And it's a very unsettling and strange moment. And it's sort of a dreamscape or a wonderland for a little bit.
I found it to be a very sweet chapter.
Yeah.
Too. Allie's point of view, I mean, their family has some mild dysfunctions, but you're basically seeing the most stable, loving, fortunate version of a family in that chapter, more or less, that we're going to see in this book, except for maybe the one that we encounter in the next chapter.
Take us home.
Pure language. And so good old Alex, Sasha's one-night stand from the first chapter, reappears in the last chapter. Very, very cyclical version of time. He's in his late 30s, early 40s. He's a dad. And I forget exactly how he's been making his living, but he wants to get into the music industry and he wants to mix for Benny Salazar. We learned that Benny Salazar has had a hilarious career rejuvenation brought about. He's fired from Salazar's records because he gets tired of sort of the commercialization of the music industry. And to symbolize this, has a meeting where he serves the executives in the record cow pies as a metaphor for what he thinks that they're offering the wider audience. He gets fired, but then there's this new era of streaming music, it's funny because we're now more or less in the time that Jennifer Egan is projecting to, and she's off, but she's not that far off. There's this funny music where little kids using devices, what they call handsets, but we would now call tablets and phones, are basically using something like Spotify to buy music, inspiring, and they, for whatever reason, they have access to their parents' finances, and this is inspiring musicians to remix their music with kind of like baby talk added to it. And so you have some musicians who are having kind of like a revival, and in the midst of this, they're trying to finally turn good old Scotty Hausman, the slide guitarist and Benny's high school best friend, into a rock star. And Scotty has a few kid songs that he's written and performs that are kind of popular. But he also, they believe, has an appeal as an adult. He's very soulful. To me, he kind of comes across a little bit like Townes Van Zandt, except for with a slide guitar, but kind of a weathered, aging poet who's been through a lot, but has a soulfulness in his voice that has been.
I thought of your observation long ago that Randy Newman, Bruce Springsteen, and Tom Waits orbit the same star, but in like a triangular format. I thought of Randy Newman as kind of like with maybe a little more edge to him for Scotty Houseman.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't really. Somebody who plays slide guitar and sings doesn't really exist in the kind of rock and roll world. But yeah, I could see that. Yeah, he is in that. So those three, by the way, were all referred to as the New Dylans, along with John Prine. And this was a music industry thing that all the A&R people were looking for the next Dylan, and at various times, Bruce Springsteen, Randy Newman. Did I say Leonard Cohen or Tom Waits?
Tom Waits, Bruce Springsteen, and Randy Newman. Yeah.
Yeah, we're all sort of kind of lumped in as possible new Dylans. And of course, they all prove to be the original versions of themselves as opposed to new Dylans in a wonderful way. So they're trying to promote this concert, and rather than being hired to mix music, Benny offers Alex a job as the anonymous captain of a blind team, which are marketing terms that Lulu, who's now in graduate school, knows about. Alex thinks he's just kind of invented this marketing scheme on his own, which is basically he's going to reach out to a lot of his friends who are social media influencers and pay them to say something good about Scotty Houseman's concert that's upcoming, but in a way that is not understood to be a paid promotion. So it's secretly paid content, which is, devious and unethical. And Alex knows it's devious and unethical, but he also wants to impress Benny Salazar and make some money. So he goes along with it. He has a young daughter. He has this meeting with Lulu where they have a really weird conversation about this marketing tactic, and he's got his baby with him, and Lulu eventually becomes exhausted by all this talking and just starts texting him or teeing him, as she says, because that's much easier. Pure, what does she say? Pure information. So Alex starts a texting relationship with Lulu, and at one point observes that the sort of baby talk he can use with his 2-year-old also works perfectly well as texts to this, 24-year-old graduate student who prefers texting to talk. And they pull it off. They successfully get a pretty big audience at this concert for Scotty Houseman. Scotty has a panic attack at the last minute, and Benny enlists Alex to sort of physically force him to perform. Alex gets kneed in the gonads, but then Lulu's sort of charm and the fact that he's a young woman, and a kind of an echo of the kind of flirty relationship that Scotty had with Sasha in an earlier chapter. Scotty is sort of charmed by Lulu and allows Lulu to lead him out onto the stage, where he sings first his child hits that the kids like, and then stands up and starts playing his real music. And it's a wildly successful concert, and it makes Scotty Houseman a star, and it revives Benny Salazar, and we assume it brings about good things for Alex as well, since he participated, and for Lulu. And it's a weird, similar to Selling the General, these people behave kind of unethically and badly and yet manage to sort of forge some sort of success. And then there's a funny moment where, again, Alex is trying to make a relationship with Benny and mentions Sasha, and that sends Benny down memory lane, and he remembers he really liked Sasha, but he had to fire her because she stole things. And they go to her old apartment, which they both remember, and try to find her, but she's not there. And end, right? Fiend. Did I forget anything?
We get some details about the world. Basically, the world is a surveillance state. There are military choppers that hover overhead all the time.
Oh yeah, you can't use a stroller because it would hamper rapid evacuation.
The concert takes place in the Footprint, which is the memorial for the Twin Towers. Apparently, the world has warmed enough that it will be in the 70s and 80s in January. And the ocean has risen enough that New York City is kind of hemmed in by a wall that keeps the ocean at bay. And there's a scene where people go up on the wall to get a glimpse of the sunset, which is something that doesn't happen too much anymore because they now live in a city that is ringed by a very tall wall. A lot of the marketing terms that they throw around seem to also have been picked up by that the Jules Jones chapter where he talks about quantum particle physics, about spooky particles that are able to speak to each other at large distances.
That's real.
Yeah.
That's all real. Yeah. Well, and that chapter is written in the 90s, but yeah, it seems Jules is presaging all of this. It seems like, yeah.
And that's like sort of the mechanism upon which a lot of these like marketing schemes function. With these sort of unknown teams that are connected to each other in a quantum manner.
A quantum network. And it seems to also indicate that our metaphor of virality for the spread of information is inaccurate. That in fact, when something goes what we used to call viral, it's actually spreading much more quickly than that. It's instantaneous.
Quick timeout. I need to plug in my phone because that's what I'm running my Wi-Fi off of at the moment. And
sounds great. I'll refill my coffee.
Oh, perfect. Oh, what was that question I wanted to ask Jesse?
I have apricots.
Oh, nice. Don't eat too many of those. You'll get real farty.
12. Well, you'll get the farts, to be sure.
So many farts.
They'll create a tempest in your bowels.
Tasty, but fibrous.
It'll be like the passes to get to Canada from Oregon and Washington.
All plugged up.
Plugged up with wind everywhere and blowing liquids and solids.
Oh, gross.
Upper middle brow.
Lower brow. Lower brow. Lower middle because we're doing potty humor, but with accents.
Exactly. So that's the book, right?
That's the book. So this is the first title in our series that I came up with called The Future Sucks. And my question to you is, does this future suck to you?
Well, it's tricky, and I feel like I'm always giving you mealy-mouthed answers. The future of New York with the wall around it and 80-degree weather in January, which I wouldn't mind a little bit of right now, and the surveillance state, I think, yes, sucks. And it is, I can see the threads that Jennifer Egan is pulling at, since the surveillance state has increased, since September 11th and since the proliferation and marketing and influencing and all of those things have become more and more powerful forces. Although she's really put a kind of force multiplier on all of those things, including climate change. Mm-hmm. Perhaps you could imagine a future that sucks that much in 100 years. That part of the future sucks, although oddly, most of these characters are much happier in the future and I don't know if it's through simple maturity or through other forces, have achieved a kind of equilibrium, have let go of some psychological problems, have become more comfortable with themselves, have overcome some challenges. And one of the questions I wondered last time was, if time is the Goon Squad, and if time is a ravager, which is what we see in the first chapter, are we ever going to see time the healer or time the maturer? And I think we do get a little bit of that in the last two chapters. Mm-hmm. And so even though the external future sucks, the future of these characters is actually a bit brighter than one might expect from the first side or first half of the novel. What do you think?
Yeah. This particular world of the last few chapters, it doesn't seem like a great place, and is, I hope, one that we're not headed for. But there's a moment in the last chapter when Alex and Benny go, looking for Sasha's apartment, and Alex sort of wonders like what's happened, and Benny just says like, I mean, you grew up. Like we all grew up. Yeah, I think you're right. The way that you talked about like the first half of the book feels like Time the Ravager. And it maybe it's not Time the Healer, but like, I don't know, sort of like Time the accepted the accepted force that propels our life forward for better or for worse. There's not like a nice Ravager, or there's no nice epithet for that.
Bosco, we learn in a very quick sentence, turns out okay. You know?
And what is he doing?
I don't remember. What is he doing?
He's a dairy farmer, parlaying his love of ice cream, I imagine.
That's right. Of course. Yeah. But that's a great thing for Bosco to be doing.
And he doesn't die. He doesn't have a suicide tour. It's wonderful.
No, yeah. He turns out all right. I would say that, Sasha is about as happy as you could imagine the character that we have met all this time being in her her middle age, right? I think she's about 45 when we meet her in the last chapter, and things have turned out as well for Sasha as they possibly could. And actually, I have a question about that. I'll ask you in a little bit, but actually, you know what? I'll ask you that right now.
Awesome.
So Benny turns out okay. He seems to be doing pretty well. Scotty has this moment of triumph at the end. You know, certainly time does ravage these characters, but as ravaged as they all were midway through the book, they all kind of end up in a better place at the end of side B than they were at the end of side A. And you read that exposition bit at the end of chapter 11, where we learn that Sasha marries, and then we get the chapter with the PowerPoint presentation narrated by her daughter, who seems like a pretty precocious, sort of a lot like Sasha is described by Uncle Teddy, a kind of bright sort of young woman or kid. Do you feel like there's enough of an explanation for Sasha's arriving at a relatively happy place at the end of the novel, offered by the novel?
That's a good question. So this is one of those questions where I need to separate my projections from like what I hope for myself and for the world, from what I hope for the characters in this book. Because I would like to believe that things do in fact turn out for the best eventually. And that's not something that we layer on top of bad outcomes and just sort of say like, oh yeah, the things turned out for the best anyway. I really do hope and believe that things will turn out for the best. I think the reason that I believe in that transformation is that we learn so much about Sasha. We learn so much about. I do think that she and Benny share the spotlight of the twin towers, but we sort of learn more about Sasha's emotional interior, and she has had a tough go of it, and it's not been easy. But there's this moment in the end of the chapter where Rob dies, where he imagines saying to Sasha, "I believe in you," which is the same thing that Sasha reads on the scrap of paper in Alex's wallet in chapter 1, which she finds at that point in her life a little naive and a little sad and embarrassing. And I think that Sasha does finally sort of alchemize all of this heartbreak into something beautiful and worthwhile. She's really making that happen with her art, which apparently is, she calls them found objects, the title of the first chapter. So she's sort of taken her magpie's impulse and transformed it into art. And I buy it. I think I buy it because Egan has done such a masterful job of showing us all the adversity that Sasha has had without kind of rubbing our faces in it. She's not sort of like, look at how hard this character has it. It's done effectively and in very careful ways. And yeah, I do believe in the transformation. And she's also given us enough time. And I think Drew's presence, like you said, Drew is like the sort of bland, good guy that maybe helps kind of complete Sasha the way that as she's sitting in that apartment in Naples, the sort of sun drops into that little wireframe that she has set up.
Yeah, God damn it. Because like I feel like our podcast is better when one of us gets to be the heel. And I went into that being like, no, it's not earned. There's no indication that things are going to turn out well for Sasha. But God damn it, I think you're right. I think I buy it too. And I'm pissed because I wanted to have something to poke Jennifer Egan about. I want to puncture the myth of the genius Jennifer Egan. But I think two things you said that really resonate. To me, this book reminds me a little bit of Richard Linklater's work. Slacker, for one, and especially Boyhood, and using time as a substitute for plot. We see somebody in A, and we see somebody in B, and we don't necessarily see what happened in between, but we fill in the detail. And this novel is very much doing that. And is it legit for a novelist to substitute hope for plot? Because like you, I do think we see enough of Sasha's interior life to know that she is a gentle, generous person in her heart. So when she's stealing things, she's overcome with guilt. And in that very first chapter, we see a moment where the guilt wins and she gives the object back because she has enough compassion for this person who she really could harm quite a bit by taking their wallet when they need it, at a moment where they most need it. Sure, that woman would probably survive that, but it would ruin her life for the next couple of weeks, and she gives it back. And you have that moment when she crawls into the bed with Rob or Bobby. And you have that moment where she sits there with her uncle and watches the sun. And I think kind of like Boyhood, you're getting these little glimpses of that which is in Sasha, which has the potential to turn her into this nurturing, creative mom that we see in the PowerPoint chapter. And it reminds me of, now that you say that, did you read A Swim in the Pond in the Rain, the George Saunders sort of? Yeah. His observation about the character's transformation in Master and Man. Because, so that character in Master and Man, he's this rich nobleman in Russia, and he's been treating his servant abysmally for the entire book, and he gets them stranded in the snow, and they're both likely to die, and he tries to abandon him. Fails, and then once he's realized he's failing and they're both likely to die, suddenly he becomes obsessed with saving the life of that man and sacrifices himself to do it. I'm getting moved just thinking about that. Damn you, Tolstoy. And somehow that Tolstoy works. George Saunders explains why it works, because when he has that moment where he changes from being completely selfish to completely selfless in the span of about a paragraph, he does it in a way that is consistent with what we know about him up to that point. There are a number of character traits. So I believe he's sort of like obsessive, and he's kind of mathematical, and he's devoted, and he's stubborn, and he brings all of those qualities that he used to be selfish and kind of look after himself. When he then sets about this task of being selfless, all of those other qualities that we're familiar with come with him, and he does that task in that same way. And I think we see that in Sasha. So when we see Sasha sort of patiently interacting with her daughter, or kind of explaining to her husband, who is blandly good but not as insightful as Sasha is about music and art, what the kid is trying to express when he talks about rock and roll pauses, it all works because we've seen this insight in Sasha. We've seen this kindness in Sasha, despite her very self-destructive behavior up to this point. those qualities have already been there. So I gotta grudgingly agree that Jennifer Egan pulled it off. It's annoying. I'm like a heel, like who's like, I guess I'll team up with you and we'll be tag team partners in celebration of Jennifer Egan.
I think if you kind of polled literary types of the last 20 years, I would bet that this book would show up on a high percentage of their lists of important and successful novels. It's going to be hard to do much other than be like, wow, nailed it.
This is really good. Yeah.
Yeah. Because
I have another attempt.
Okay.
Which is
do it.
I'm gonna another attempt to sink the Jennifer Egan Battleship. This is very similar to the question
we need to sink
about.
Can't we can we like scratch the paint or like blow out an engine? Like, I don't know if we need to sink it.
Let's scratch the paint a little bit here. Part of it too is that as you're reading the novel, there are a number of moments as I'm reading the novel where I feel like, why is this in here? Mm-hmm. Why are we doing? And I come to suspect, like, Jennifer Egan, are you just showing off? Are you just showing us that you can write a whole chapter in second person and another one in PowerPoint? Are you just naming it side A and side B to show off? Like, your willingness and ability to experiment with great facility with literary convention, because there's a lot of that. She's good at that. So, chapter 8. Do we need chapter 8? I mean, it's good, but do we need it in this novel?
Yes. I'm going to do my best here. Yeah, I know. I knew that was coming. Okay. Yes, we do. We absolutely need this chapter. We need this chapter because
we should remind the listener real quick which one we're talking about.
This is Selling the General. And this is the chapter that we spend in Dolly's point of view. We learn so much about other characters from chapters that are not focused on those characters. We learn about the damage of the way that the world treats Kitty Jackson in the way that she behaves in this chapter. That's very important. And then when we get to Jules' chapter, that is a sort of an example. We're sort of streaming in from the general to the specific. We get a very specific example of that. We need that chapter because that helps buttress Stephanie's chapters and helps us continue to learn about things like the police state. I think that the police state that Jules envisions may actually have come to pass in the world of the final chapters.
Yeah, that's right. It seems like a wild, crazy fantasy, but maybe he's actually describing the measures they took.
And we need...
What is it? Like, you're about to enter a park and you get your ID badge scan, and then any sort of like indication that you've ever committed any sort of bad behavior.
If you've been famous or like infamous, he wants people to be treated, infamy to have as much an equal meter as fame. We also need Lulu to have a very strange and probably unsettling childhood event that is going to kind of like nudge her off of probably a normal childhood arc, because holy crap, this would do that if you were 9 or 10 and basically witnessed somebody getting abducted by a genocidal dictator. And
it does explain why Lulu would be so comfortable creating a blind team with an anonymous captain, because that's like nothing compared to what her mother was doing to make a living in terms of PR.
We also need it because we really need some action at this particular moment in the novel. I think this novel would be a little starved for page-turning action, which you certainly get in this particular chapter, because you got a protagonist with a very clear need. So maybe this chapter, in terms of plot, is not totally necessary, but I think in the way that it offers nuance and understanding and context to the rest of the book, it's totally necessary. And that's that's why I think this novel is so fucking remarkable, is that it is a series of overlapping stories that all inform each other. I don't know if you remember in the 90s, there was this promise of the hypertext novel. And like a lot of thinkers and academics were imagining that somehow novels would be construed in kind of a like hyperlinked format where you would read something and click on a link and be taken to another area. And it didn't work because the way that we sort of experience narrative as humans is eventually pretty linear. Like we're much better at being given something that is already structured in an A to B, B to C format. And I think that, holy shit, she pulled it off, because she realized that there is a way to do a linear narrative where still your attention does kind of head off on these other links. And I think the brilliance of her novel is that she knows where to put the link, and she knows where to curtail the particular plot of a chapter in such a way that we get just enough information to bridge us to the next, sort of web page of the novel.
Do you suspect that there are like 6 or 7 Visit from the Goon Squad chapters out there that she roughed out and was like, nah, this one doesn't work?
Yes.
We're going to leave it out.
And one of them did get released and then did make its way into the Candy House. But she published it in 2012 because she was intrigued by this concept of trying to write a short story as a series of tweets. But yeah, I bet that there's more. Like this book is so good and so that, I mean, I think you've had this experience yourself in creating anything. Whenever you make something good, there is like 90% of the other stuff that you made that ends up on the cutting room floor, or insert your metaphor about, shaping statues out of rock or whatnot.
Well, and it makes me wonder too, whether she mapped out this novel and had this 11 chapter or 13 chapter outline and then went and wrote those chapters, or whether on a given day she would just sit down and say like, okay, let's write a chapter from the perspective of Benny's wife. I don't know, let's call her Stephanie, country club. Let's just see what happens, and just like would do that, and then decided to keep the ones that could be assembled.
I've got a question for you about the epigraph. Okay. This is the epigraph of the book, and it's from Proust's In Search of Lost Time. Poets claim that we recapture for a moment the self that we were long ago when we enter some house or garden in which we used to live in our youth. But these are the most hazardous pilgrimages, which end as often in disappointment as in success. It is in ourselves that we should rather seek to find those fixed places, contemporaneous with different years. And what I take from that is, there is an urge to kind of revisit the locations of our earlier selves and to see what's still there. And I know that for me, that just like Proust says, those moments have usually ended in disappointment. I'm thinking of kind of returning to New York City after leaving there, going back to the restaurant where I worked in New York City, revisiting the school in Vermont where I taught for a few years. And I was wondering if you have had that similar experience in any way, and does considering this epigraph kind of change your experience of this book?
Okay, I'm thinking about it, and I find what Proust to be saying to be a little bit obscure. And I can't tell if what he's saying is, don't seek to know yourself by visiting places that are redolent, because that redolence you experience in those places is some kind of nostalgia. And what actually if you want to know yourself, just consider yourself as you exist at a particular moment. So a warning against nostalgia, and maybe even a warning against memory in self-construction. Or is he saying something else about what you were alluding to, disappointment in a particular place? For some reason, I instinctually feel like I disagree with Proust, that in terms of knowing who I am, I find it very useful when there are moments that bring about a memory that would have been buried otherwise. So it could be visiting, say, the University of Virginia campus, as I did for about a week when I was lucky enough to spend a week there interacting with some students and talking about podcasting and things like that. And they put me up on the grounds of the university, and I found myself just memories emerging simply from the smell of the boxwoods and the sight of the cedar cones or whatever, pine cones or whatever, or fir, whatever sort of seed pods were all around, or just the smell of fall on the campus brought me back to a time in my late teens and early 20s, and little memories associated with particular places would reemerge. And I don't know that there was a particular sense of frustration and disappointment. My time in Virginia was neither universally great or universally bad. It was sometimes great, it was sometimes bad, it was often okay. New York might be different because I had a rough time in New York for about 6 months, and I haven't necessarily recently wandered through, although a few years later I came back and I was delighted to discover that I still knew the best bike lanes to take to get across Brooklyn. So I don't know, I'm kind of free associating here, but I think I disagree with Proust. I don't know if that's necessarily your question, because I actually find those moments of discovering kind of buried memories, even just like me reminding you about the time that you and Brandon Stafford made an announcement together. To me, that's a gift. It's like a little moment of your life back and a little bit of a reminder who you are. And I would imagine that in a tiny micro way that your sense of being Chris Bagg is slightly made more whole, remembering that you have a slightly richer view of yourself in that moment. So I don't entirely agree. You and I both gave, I don't know, Cryptonomicon, what, like a B minus, C plus or something like that. We didn't actually give it a grade, but somewhere in there. But that moment where Enoch Root and Randy are in the jail together, and Enoch Root is asking Randy, how did you recognize me when you heard my voice after we had been emailing all this time? And Randy sort of ponders it. And Enoch Root has this hypothesis that there was some, I forget what he called it, like a root. I don't remember if the term for it, but it was almost something like, it was almost arcane, like the soul or the self. That there is something familiar about the Enoch Root that's speaking to Randy in the cell, the Enoch Root that's talking to Randy on the phone, and the Enoch Root that's emailing Randy, such that he can recognize that that is the same person somehow. And I think that Jennifer Egan is assembling these characters the same way, right? We're getting a half hour of their lives here, or 6 hours of their lives there, spread out over 20, 30, 40 years. And you assemble those into these linear arcs, and notice that one of the first things you and I instinctively do is create a timeline for these characters. We give them years. We sort of figure out, oh, Sasha must have been about 19 then, and she was 22 then, and now she's married. She's probably about 45. We're constructing that more traditional novel. But the other thing we're doing is we're constructing a person. And it does seem to me that maybe that epigraph is getting at that idea somehow, that we assemble a person together from memory and from glimpses. But I don't know. I just dribbled a lot of stuff out for you. So maybe I'll shut up for a little bit and hear what you have to say.
No, I love that. I love that answer. I also love that you ended up in a very Proustian place talking about the smells of the University of Virginia campus. But instead of a little tray of French cookies, it's seed pods that are the things that take you spiraling back through memory. Yeah, it's an interesting epigraph, because I think I kind of think it's actually sort of clumsier than like the rest of the book.
Yeah, it seems misapplied a little bit. It almost seems to undermine what Egan's doing here.
I think what he's trying to make is a distinction between physical location and emotional location. And I think that you're getting at more the truth of the emotional location. And I think that's what Egan is trying to do as well. And I think it gets recapitulated in the last chapter of the book when Alex and Benny like hatch this completely harebrained, and they know it's stupid idea to like go to Sasha's old apartment and ring the bell. And both of them are like, maybe it's her. And of course it's not. But then the book marvelously ends with, another different young woman standing at the door to Sasha's apartment, fumbling with her keys. And it's, it's a metaphor that flirts a little bit with the too much. Like it gets a little close to being like, oh, it's a little too neat, but it works. Like, because this whole book is about fumbling.
I took that very much as like another future victim of the Goon Squad, right? Like, here's this young woman, just waiting to kind of be ravaged by time, in the way that we've seen Sasha be ravaged and the other characters be ravaged. And New York feels that way too, right? Like just the endless parade of talented young people who come to New York sort of wide-eyed and full of ambitions and hopes. And most of them end up being put through some kind of meat grinder or another, even if they end up okay on the other side of that meat grinder.
And I think that's what the epigraph is doing. It's sort of trying to, and it's another feature of like Egan's kind of mastery, where, she starts and ends the book in the same place, with an epigraph about like the caution of going to the physical location.
Oh, that's true.
In search of the emotional things that you're looking for.
Yeah. I mean, literally, don't go looking for Sasha in her old apartment. She's not there anymore. She's in the California desert. It's very literal.
Right. She's happy in the California desert. And I do hope it's a hopeful ending, but once again, that is Chris Bagg, the wary optimist, who's
and I guess one of maybe a question that I would put to you right now. I mentioned in Boyhood. Did I say this earlier? I'm sorry if I said this earlier. That in Boyhood, time is substituted for plot. At the end of this novel, hope is substituted for plot, and I'm wondering, like, can you get away with that? At first, I'm like, that's cheating. Because I want Sasha to be happy doesn't mean that you have like created the necessary conditions of her happiness. But is it cheating? Hope is real.
Hope is real, and the reason why it works is that we believe in Sasha as a real complicated person. This wouldn't work if we were in more sort of archetypal fiction or lesser fiction, where the work hadn't been done to imagine the characters, these characters.
Well, and maybe it's the master in man insight too, which is that she does change, but she changes in a way that is consistent with what we know about her.
Right, consistent as suggested by the author, which is, I think, the reason why it's good enough is that all of these things are suggestions that we pick up as we read.
Yeah.
I really want to read this passage at the end of chapter 10 because I think I think it's the emotional center of the book. In sort of thinking about Sasha, like this might be the moment where she does begin to maybe it's the bottom.
This is the chapter that is from Rob's second person point of view and is Sasha in college with her roommates and boyfriends and people like that.
Yep. And it's the very end of the chapter, and Rob and Drew have gone swimming in the East River. And Rob has suddenly realized that he has probably literally gotten in over his head. Help! Drew! As you flail, knowing you're not supposed to panic, panicking will drain your strength. Your mind pulls away as it does so easily, so often, without your even noticing sometimes, leaving Robert Freeman Jr. to manage the current alone, while you withdraw to the broader landscape, the water and buildings and streets, the avenues like endless hallways, your dorm full of sleeping students, the air thick with their communal breath. You slip through Sasha's open window, floating over the sill lined with artifacts from her travels, a white seashell, a small gold pagoda, a pair of red dice. Her harp is in one corner with its small wood stool. She's asleep in her narrow bed, her burned red hair dark against the sheets. You kneel beside her, breathing the familiar smell of Sasha's sleep, whispering her into her ear some mix of, "I'm sorry," and "I believe in you," and "I'll always be near you, protecting you," and "I will never leave you. I'll be curled around your heart for the rest of your life," until the water pressing my shoulders and my chest crushes me awake, and I hear Sasha screaming into my face, "Fight! Fight! Fight!"
It makes me want to go back and read that part where she finds the scrap of paper that says, "I believe in you," and see if there's any reference to Rob in that moment. Because it now makes me feel like, yes, if stealing the wallet was the bottom, that scrap of paper it's Rob, staying with her and believing in her and protecting her in a impossible way, because this is not a supernatural book.
No, it's not. But Egan has created a world where maybe it's possible, and maybe Sasha has repressed it and doesn't really notice in that moment.
Sasha senses it, whether it's there or not. And I found being in Rob's even second person consciousness excruciating. I found a lot of this book excruciating to read. In that the characters were so broken, and in some cases behaving in such destructive ways to themselves or to other people that I could barely tolerate it sometimes. And obviously that's a compliment in terms of the vividness that all of that was drawn. What else anything else you wanted to say about that reading?
The wild and totally somehow earned shift from second person narration to first person narration in the last sentence of the goddamn chapter, which is a big no-no. I mean, you're not supposed to change point of view stuff between chapters, let alone within paragraphs, and maybe, not even, it's certainly not within sentences, but it does the job. It slams the finality of this particular moment home, that we are experiencing somebody's very personal, non-second person, very first person death.
And God damn you, Jennifer Egan, once again, you're not just showing off, because it actually works. Because the second person is a kind of stand-in for Rob's out-of-body quality. That Rob is always standing outside of Rob, watching Rob. And Rob is closeted, What are those two fags doing? At one point when he is making out with another man, but he imagines himself watching himself disapprovingly doing that. That's what he says. And in that moment, he even says, he gives his full name.
Robert Freeman Jr.
Yeah, and so that he is abstracted from himself in that moment of drowning. The second person vanishes, it collapses, and he becomes himself at the very end there, and it works. It's so tempting to say that she's just showing off what she can do, but it's not. It actually works. It actually tells the story.
Yeah, poor Rob is so sad, so broken, so alienated from himself, that the one moment that he finally merges with himself is the moment.
Yeah, it's sad. It's very sad, and it is excruciating. Did you come up with trivia? We've been going back and forth about whether we would do trivia the second time.
I do have trivia.
Okay, I have trivia too. Host goes first. That's what we said, right? Jennifer Egan is a novelist, but she also sometimes reviews fiction for the New York Times. I don't know if you knew that.
I didn't know that.
So she has, despite being, I would say, rather a literary badass, she occasionally evinces a sort of upper middlebrow sensibility and will celebrate books that might not be considered highbrow. And so, which airport bookstore stalwart did Jennifer Egan review glowingly?
Oh my God, this is great. This is redolent of your last trivia question, which also involved like Hudson News.
Indeed.
Scotty,
Which book that you could find at Hudson News at the airport in LaGuardia did Jennifer Egan give a very glowing positive review to? Was it A, Rebecca Wells' Divine Secrets of the Yaya Sisterhood, B, Elizabeth Gilbert's Eat, Pray, Love, or C, E.L. James' 50 Shades of Grey?
Awesome. Oh my God. Oh wow. You have picked, I'm going to toss out 50 Shades of Grey. I think you have included that as like very tempting host bait. Let's see if Bagg can resist this. I heard Elizabeth Gilbert interviewed on the Tim Ferriss show recently, and she has this marvelous way of saying no to people that where she sort of recapitulates the request and honors it, and then says, "And no." And so it's like an inversion of yes and it's and no. Because of that, I recognize a little bit of the same kind of thinkerly qualities between her and maybe Egan. I'm going to go with Eat, Pray, Love.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And
hooray!
I would heartily endorse. I think Eat, Pray, Love is a underrated book. I think it's actually, it comes across as this sort of spoiled, privileged lady traveling around without real problems. And it is that, but she has a real self-consciousness around that and humor to it. And yes, Elizabeth Gilbert is very smart, I think. Mm-hmm. I've not read the Rebecca Wells book. It might be wonderful for all I know. I mean, certainly enough Hudson News customers thought so.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's so easy to consign some of those books to sort of the
lower
dustbin
middle
of
brow
literary
dustbin.
Success. Yeah, totally. But most of the time,
they got to be doing something right.
Exactly. Yeah, they're usually doing a lot of things right. They're easy prey, and they shouldn't be. My trivia question is similar. We're in a sort of highbrow, lowbrow place. Along with Marcel Proust as one of the big influences of this book, Egan cites a famous HBO series as the other main inspiration for A Visit from the Goon Squad. Was that series A, The Wire, B, 6 Feet Under, or C, The Sopranos?
When you said HBO series, I immediately said The Sopranos. And I think I'm just going to go with that without overthinking it. The Sopranos.
You got it. Yeah. The reason that it was so captivating to her was it was one of the first times that she saw a kind of polyphonic treatment. Where all of the different characters were really given very thorough and real character expositions and arcs. And so that was one of the things that she'd been really thinking about as she was starting to work on this.
I wouldn't have made that connection necessarily, but I make other connections.
Well, let's this is the question that we ask whenever we finish up a book. JPD, will you read this book again in your lifetime?
I don't know. Probably yes. And probably, if for no other reason, that the book still contains puzzles and mysteries to me that I want to solve. I want to understand how certain things are accomplished as a writer, and so I will probably come back to it for that reason. There only one or two of the chapters did I find pleasurable, like sort of, you mentioned the other day some of the wonderful reasons you like to read, but part of why I also read is just for company and entertainment, and this book only occasionally provides company and entertainment. So it is tough, but I think the answer is yes, because there's so much to learn, and I'm curious how certain things are accomplished, and I'll probably go back at some point and try to figure that out. What about you, Chris?
It's so funny. I'll probably read this book again this afternoon.
Yeah.
or this week, for sure. It's so funny. I find company and entertainment in this book. In every single chapter, I find somebody that I understand, which worries me about myself. But yeah, this I really do find a real sense of comfort and belonging and community with these people. It makes me think of my high school English teacher in her own reprising of her own sort of literary background, loving Adrian Rich, the poet, and getting a lot of feedback from friends of hers that Adrian Rich was just a grumpy, sad old woman. To which my English teacher would reply to them, "Then so am I." And that's how I feel about this book. That's how I feel about the characters in it. Yeah.
I think everybody has a degree of brokenness and self-destructive and antisocial tendencies that many of these characters we witness. One thing that I don't really relate to, though, is just the emotional freight of like every single sentence and moment. Like so many of the chapters, and I would say 40-Minute Lunch is very self-consciously that way, but just so many of these chapters, a character says something and sort of the emotional stakes change or reverse, or something is resolved, or something is cracked open, or somebody is angry, or somebody is sad, or somebody is dominated, or the power balance change. And I don't actually experience my life that way most of the time. And maybe that's why I'm a little bit more entertained when the forces of opposition are a little more external, because I feel like I'm constantly problem solving. I'm like, which route am I going to take? And that I'm not sort of constantly aware of my relationship to the person I'm talking with and what's changing and evolving. Every now and again, and I have conversations like that, and I find them very uncomfortable. And all the conversations in this book are like that. So I admire it. But it's an uncomfortable place for me to go. I did come up with a listener quiz. Do you think we should do
Wonderful.
that?
Yeah, let's do it.
It's pretty simple, actually. I can lay it out really quickly, which is to say, there must be other rock and roll songs out there with great pauses. So the winner of our listener quiz will be the first listener who sends us an email with 5 great rock and roll pauses not acknowledged by this novel. As long as they have a pause, give us the name of the track and the artist. Ideally, if you send us a link, that would be helpful too, so we can verify the nature of the pause. 5 rock and roll pauses to hello@uppermiddlebrow.com.
I love that. I have one last thing to add into this episode. While we were recording, I got a text message from one of our reviewers and
Jenny
one of
G
our
in
pilot
Bend.
listeners, Jenny G in Bend. And the text message received goes as follows. The mistiest and wettest run in a while in Forest Park, kept company by UMB, followed by 5 exclamation points. Loving the Zodiac ep, 1 exclamation point.
Wonderful. I believe the Zodiac ep has the shout out to Jenny at the very end too.
I think it does too. Jenny also consults on every single piece of Upper Middlebrow design that shows up on the website or on our Instagram feed.
Terrific.
Or on our Twitter feed.
Well, I don't know her, but I am very fond of her reviews and her enthusiasm for our show, and her enthusiasm for our podcasting host voices as well.
Jenny G. and Bend is a singular human being that I really hope you get to meet at some point.
Well, let's make it happen. We'll have a upper middle brow party in the Pacific Northwest at some point. Live event.
Sounds good. Or a live event. Yeah.
Yeah, we should start planning for that. Maybe all 9 of our listeners will come. So, listener, next time we're moving on to Jonathan Letham's The Arrest, correct? Read roughly the first half of it. I don't know how many chapters that is, but I trust your mathematics skills, listeners. Do you want to take us out, Chris?
Sure thing. Thank you all for listening. Please remember to rate and review us. If you give us a 5-star review on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, we will read your review on the air. And Upper Middle Brow is a Small Point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes, creators and hosts. Music from Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by Chris Bagg. You can learn more about us at uppermiddlebrow.com.
Such great design! Really good website! Yay!
If Jenny were in fact here, she would just be in the background going, Chris Bagg!
Wonderful.
Which is how she always greets me.
Wonderful, wonderful.